Hi, I'm Ken McLeod. I'm the Policy Director for the League of American Bicyclists. Today we're going to be talking about the 2018 benchmarking report on bicycling and walking in the United States. We're going to wait a little bit to see if more people get on the line, but I'll just start by giving some background on the benchmarking report and the League. The League of American Bicyclists is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to building a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. We were really excited to do the benchmarking report on bicycling and walking in the United States. This is a report that started under the Alliance for Biking and Walking, and when the Alliance for Biking and Walking, which existed to serve bicycle advocacy organizations, unfortunately ceased operations a few years ago. This was one of the projects that we were able to take on to continue that mission of helping people be advocates for biking and walking throughout the United States. So I'll just give it another beat or two here. We've got some great panelists today. We have Dr. Melissa Jean BOPP from Penn State University. We have BYRON Rushing from the Atlanta Regional Commission. We have Danielle Aragoni from AARP, their Livable Communities program. And yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to all of you, telling you about what the benchmarking report on bicycling and walking in the United States can help you learn about and how you can use it in your work. Probably the most important thing to know is that it is a very large report. You can download it at bikeleague.org/benchmarking-report. The printed copy is about 415 pages, so this is like a reference book for everyone interested in the state of biking and walking in the United States. Going back to the background, this is an advocate-created report. So this was scoped by advocates starting in 2003, the Alliance for Biking and Walking working with its member organizations. It was first created at the local level in that iteration, and then in the national level in 2007. And since 2010, it has been produced every 2 years, compiling information from federal data sources, compiling information from cities and states, data that we get by working with our advocacy organizations. And if you haven't already, I encourage you to go to bikeleague.org/benchmarking-report to download the report. And this is the first time that the League of American Bicyclists has published it. So we are definitely excited to get it out there. So why do we do this? Why was this created by advocates? Because we thought there was a gap in what was out there about biking and walking in the United States. We didn't have easy access so that every state and local advocacy organization could access federal, state, and local data sources in kind of a uniform manner. So we benchmark so that we can promote that data collection and that data availability. We also do it in a comparable way over time so we can measure progress and evaluate how we're doing as organizations, how we're doing as federal, state, and local governments who want to improve bicycling and are pursuing policies to make biking better. And then ultimately, we want to support you. We want to support people who are working to make bicycling and walking safer, get more people biking and walking. And we think that the benchmarking report does that by giving people easy access to these tools that help tell the story about biking and walking, and give them kind of the background that you need to take action. So we're going to get into portions of the report later, but some quick takeaways is that there has been a really strong increase in how states and cities are supporting biking and walking. Pretty much every major city has a bicycle or pedestrian plan at this point. Most major cities have complete streets policies. States have made progress there too, although it's been a little bit less in the last few years. The unfortunate thing is that all of this effort so far has not translated into broadly shared improvements in bicycling and pedestrian safety, or mode share, which unfortunately in the United States is chiefly defined by the percentage of people biking or walking to work, because we don't have better data sources. We've also seen federal, state, and local funding generally increase, but there's a little bit of inconsistency between states and regions and over time. And so all of that can be found further explained in various ways in this report. We tried to look at the data from as many angles as we could, but that's kind of the high-level takeaways of what the state of bicycling and walking in the United States is today. Just a quick note about what communities are included. So this was, started in 2007. It includes national level data, includes data on all 50 states. It includes the 50 largest cities in the United States and 19 additional cities that the Alliance started collecting data about in 2014. Some of those cities are also cities that were the largest cities in 2007 that for whatever reason were no longer the largest cities in 2014. So we've tried to keep that data going over time in cities that started in the report back in 2007. So the report is very large. It is 5 chapters: introduction, which kind of gives the broad level overview; find your angle, which is where you'll find kind of featured people discussing how their work intersects with biking and walking, how they use data to promote biking and walking. And our 3 panelists who are joining me today are all also featured in the Find Your Angle chapter. There's Make Your Case, which looks at 10 different topics, kind of in-depth, breaking down data about those, kind of giving ideas and explaining policies that lead to good outcomes in those topics. Show Your Data, which looks at all of the various federal, state, and local data that we have on biking and walking, and then an appendix that kind of explains how we brought all this data together, how we found it. So I'm about to hand it over to our great speakers that we have today. So all of them are featured in this Find Your Angle chapter, which is really meant to help you as an advocate or an interested person or city staff kind of connect with how someone in the real world is using data like the data that is found in the benchmarking report. So we have 3 great speakers: Dr. Melissa BOPP from Penn State University, Byron Rushing from the Atlanta Regional Commission, and Danielle Aragoni from AARP Level of Communities. And we are going to start with Dr. Melissa Jean BOPP.
Hi, everyone. As Ken said, I'm a researcher at Penn State University, although you did say I was a part of the real world, and I feel like sometimes that's maybe not always the case in academia. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit about some of my my own work to give you a little bit of context on how I use the benchmarking report. I was definitely honored to be featured in the Find Your Angle section of the benchmarking report, and happy to be a part of this webinar today. So my research is primarily concerned with how community, environment, and policy influence physical activity participation, which would, of course, include walking and biking. Being in a department of kinesiology, of course, I'm concerned with the health outcomes associated with physical activity participation, including the physical health benefits of decreased morbidity and mortality, decreased chronic disease prevalence, and many positive mental health outcomes, of course, including decreased depression, anxiety, and stress, and improved sleep, and things like that. One of my longstanding interests is in the area of health disparities, and that's how the social determinants of health vary across the population and their impact on population level health. That, of course, includes how race, ethnicity, social class, sexual orientation, residential location, ability level, all those kinds of things can influence activity participation. I was probably most excited to see the social determinants of health featured in the benchmarking reports this year, so it very much is in line with a lot of the research that I do. So you can imagine that a lot of these pieces come together when studying walkable and bikeable communities. Here in my lab, in my research group, we've written a couple of papers looking at bicycle-friendly businesses and universities that are in line with the League's Bicycle-Friendly America framework. So getting a comprehensive look at how settings can be impactful on promoting walking and biking. I've also done a lot of work examining active travel to college campuses specifically, and recently we started to look at how active travel behavior changes for students as they transition away from college campuses into the workforce and get better at that whole adulting thing that we like to encourage them to do. So lastly, I really hope that I'm educating the next generation rather of walking and bicycling advocates. Not only do I instruct students on the importance of these behaviors as it relates to health outcomes and things like that, but I also teach about the roles of settings, environment, and policy for supporting active travel. And I've used the benchmarking report extensively in class to showcase the relationship between health, walking, biking, environment, and policy. And probably the most fun thing that I get to do is to take students to Copenhagen, Denmark for a study abroad experience all about bicycling, and see a lot of these things all come together in the bicycling capital of the world. So how does all of this involve the benchmarking report? Let me tell you about it on the next slide here. So as a public health researcher, I often look at things somewhat differently than my urban planner or traffic engineer colleagues. I always view walking and biking for transportation as a behavior. And before we can change behavior, that is to increase walking and biking participation, we really need to spend some time understanding what influences these behaviors. Now, the benchmarking report for me has been great for examining what some of the demographic trends are for active travel, as well as what fatality rates and some of the different trends associated with that. And for us, that provides insight on which groups of the population could be targeted with specific efforts. There's also some great insight on the relationship of walking and biking with the prevalence of disease, which is definitely insightful from a public health standpoint when we're very concerned about population level health and rates of things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, things like that. There were a number of indicators that were featured in the benchmarking report that can speak to the walking and biking culture of communities. And this was very helpful in being able to identify where different programs or policies that we could come up with could be helpful for intervening to target walking and biking behavior. The data in the report on environment and policy is very valuable. We've used it on several projects, including some that have looked at the overlap of something like complete streets policies with some of the health disparities data. So it's been essential to be able to get insight from as many places as possible, and that was a great feature of the benchmarking report. So for me as a public health researcher, identifying at-risk groups with low rates of active travel or disproportionately high rates of pedestrian and cyclist fatalities is key, and the report continues to be an invaluable resource to inform our efforts. And lastly, the whole idea behind understanding behavior is with the end goal of being able to change or promote biking behavior. And all of the above points give us a lot of insight on where to target our efforts, but then how to develop evidence-based strategies to increase walking and biking. At the end of the day, the report also has a plethora of examples and case studies to draw inspiration from. I've worked with several local organizations to be able to implement some of the ideas that we were able to find in the benchmarking report, and then we were able to develop a solid evaluation strategy in partnership with local organizations to be able to determine the effectiveness and if it's worthwhile investment of time and money. So I often lend my research-related expertise to local organizations with that goal in mind. So in thinking about in terms of granting and funding agencies, it's always helpful to have a good assessment as a part of the project plan, and I often use my expertise there and drawing inspiration from multiple sources. So to kind of summarize everything that I've hit on, I promised I wouldn't talk too long. I use the benchmarking report throughout many aspects of my research to both help promote active travel as well as combating health disparities at the end of the day. So I'm going to hand it over now to some other great local experts to share their stories about their angles.
Thank you, Dr. BOPP. It is great to hear how you use the report and how it's really useful for kind of getting a sense of what's going on and helping you choose where you might want to do research or look into interventions. I think that's a great use case of the report for other people who are interested in research, maybe reaching out to the public health community. I know you said you might not be able to stick around for questions, but if anyone has questions for Dr. BOPP, I would still say feel free to put them in the question box, and then we'll try to get to them later.
Yes, I am happy to answer any questions via email as well, so I do apologize at having to leave early.
Yeah, no problem. Glad you could make it, and glad you could be a part of the benchmarking report. And with that, I'm going to introduce Byron Rushing, the Walking and Bicycle Program Manager for the Atlantic Regional Commission. Byron is also part of the leadership at the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals, and he is also featured in the Find Your Angle chapter of the benchmarking report. So I can see your screen, Byron.
Great, thank you, Ken, and thank you to everybody for having us today. And Ken, sorry to make a correction, it's the Atlanta Regional Commission, and if anybody wants to see a copy of any of my stuff, it's all at atlantaregional.org /bikeped. So yeah, thank you for having me, and I'm going to talk kind of briefly about our regional Metro Atlanta walking and bicycling program, and in particular, how we have approached it from a data and analysis question. And this is particularly relevant for being on a webinar about the benchmarking report, because that was really foundational to where we started from a lot of our work when we merged into the new, what we call the Walk, Bike, Thrive era of our current regional active transportation plan. So I'll talk through that briefly. And I wanted to pull out a couple of snapshots of how we're using some of this data, not a comprehensive look at our program, but certainly how we use data to inform some of our efforts, and all of that can be found on our website, as I mentioned. And here we go. So the main overarching question we have is, how do we make Metro Atlanta more walkable and bikeable? How do we build a region where it's easier and safer for everyone to walk and bike in their communities or across the region, which is a particularly challenging issue if anybody has been to Metro Atlanta. We are large, we are very diverse, and we are very a bit unwieldy when it comes to transportation issues. So we had to stop and take a step back in 2012 when we started our current regional visioning process, and say, how do we break this down into constituent parts? We know that there's lots of different communities, there's lots of different types of bikeways. We wanted to make sure that we were talking equally about walking. We're still trying to understand scootering, but bike share as it was emerging in the early 20-teens. And then probably most important is, how do we rely fundamentally upon regional transit as the backbone of getting people between communities, job centers, and around the region. So we had a lot to digest and boiled it down into a few basic parts. If I can get my laggy screen to catch up with me. Sorry, Ken, are my slides moving forward? There we go. Okay, so we started diving into the research and said there is a lot that we have to understand: land use, transportation, and all the different types of connections, in addition to safety and mobility issues at the regional scale, to build active communities and improve safety and save lives. So this is kind of a big snapshot of the work that we've done. On the left is the actual Walk, Bike, Drive plan. It's written in 3 parts and 3 volumes. Part 3 is on public involvement. Part 1 is on our policy strategies. And part 2 is really a kind of a data atlas that breaks down a lot of the research that we did. We made sure that any research that we did on our team, we worked with Alta Planning and several other companies to do this, but any research that our team members did got published and got published at a high level, acknowledging that within the region, we are not the only ones who are making decisions. And we wanted that information to be available for our local communities to reference and use should they reach a different conclusion or need data from an angle that we weren't looking at. We've also continued on after Walk, Bike, Drive was adopted in 2015 to build a series of supplemental reports in specific topic areas, taking those specific research questions and pushing them out into their own report, typically with about a year's worth of staff effort to understand that issue better. But all of these are built on the current benchmarking report, or the 2010, 2012, and 2014 volumes that we were using to write Walk, Bike, Thrive, as well as the federal highway guides and all the other good national guides that have been emerging in the past decade. So those reports have really been fundamental in both how we reference information, but also kind of how we come at a lot of these questions and saying, are we asking the broadest possible set of research questions? Are we looking at this effectively? And I think really understand how are we stacking up against our peers. So I won't get into it too much, but Walk, Bike, Thrive has a strong focus on roles and responsibilities. The Regional Commission and the MPO do project prioritization. We provide federal funding assistance, and we provide staff capacity building and technical assistance. Local governments come at these questions a little bit differently in their roles, but it all boils down to the regional needs of making a safer, more mobile, and more economically competitive region built on communities that reflect each of those qualities. And that really, the safety, mobility, and economic competitiveness research lenses really did come out of the original benchmarking reports, and trying to understand how can we take this big diverse region and break it down into pieces that we can understand. The other important part, and I think something we could not have done without the benchmarking report, is to compare against some of our peers, and peers at the large city and the regional level. It's hard enough for us to gather our own data and wrangle it and get it in a digestible format, but without a great guide that we could go to and really pull information out so that quickly we can say, how are our Sunbelt peers doing, or how are the national leaders elsewhere in the region or elsewhere in the country really doing at that regional level. So that has been a tremendously beneficial resource that we've pulled from. Something that's not captured in the benchmarking report are the perspectives of our local citizens. So that's where having a big national research guide to help us start to figure out where we need to be putting our attention supports and allows us to go out and talk to people and kind of bounce ideas back and forth and understand the tremendous diversity of our region and where people are coming at this from. So I wanted to conclude with a couple of quick snapshots based out of that safety, mobility, and economic competitiveness framework. We have done a lot of research, in particular into safety and risk and the disproportionate distribution of risk for people walking or bicycling in our region, and how that's both reflected in trends as well as geography. We have done a lot to think about the Metro Atlanta region and how we break it down into opportunity zones or areas of mobility potential that are not being capitalized upon. And in particular, going back to the benchmarking report to pull out those overall national trends or some of the thresholds and breakpoints for where we need to be understanding what makes a walkable or bikeable community and how is that reflected in our data locally within the region. And then economic competitiveness, it's obviously a big political interest for a lot of our elected officials, but also we have really found that some of these opportunity zones and some of these mobility areas that provide short trips or dense concentrations of commercial or residential areas are the areas that have performed better economically over the past several economic cycles, and we've seen that in several reports. And it's really a place to say, if these are places that are doing better economically, they're denser, they're a little bit more urban, how can we continue to make walking and bicycling and hopefully transit a real part of the conversation for the mobility and economic packages that those places are offering. Since Dr. Bopp touched briefly on health, I think one of the areas that I've been very excited to see the benchmarking report grow is within this question of health and social disparities, and say, what does the health landscape look like? We've been very blessed to have some large health institutions like the CDC and several of our research universities here in the region. So we have an opportunity to get into a lot of big brain power and understand health and the health disparities better and the challenges for our region. That's something we've tried to reflect locally, and I'm glad to see that continuing to emerge as a strong national conversation as well. For us, this all boils down to data is fun. I'm a planner. I love spreadsheets and maps and charts. But at the end of the day, we have to take all of this data and triangulate it and use it for something. We have used it for our regional planning, but it goes directly into how we fund projects. So sponsors that come to us and say, we have a bikeway or a walkway or a transit project that makes the region safer, or it makes the region more mobile, or it makes the region healthier, we can really acknowledge that and reflect that in our funding priorities. Because at the end of the day, the data is fun, but we want to be building better projects that make a better region. And that's really where we've seen the success for taking this kind of real data-rich and evidence-based approach. So with Ken, I will hand it back over to you, and excited to listen to some of the other great lessons that we've heard.
Yeah, thanks, BYRON. It's great to see how you took it from the high-level data that the benchmark report provides to really contextualize data for the Atlanta region. It's really exciting to see. So our next presenter is Danielle Aragoni. She is the Livable Communities Director at AARP. And I am handing it over to her.
Okay, great. Hopefully you can see my screen okay.
Looks perfect.
Good, very good. Well, thanks for having me. We also are really pleased to be a part of both this document and the webinar today. And I want to tell you a little bit about sort of what drives us to be a part of this discussion. This headline for me really jumped out. Already today, we have 75 million people in the country that are over 50, but in just a few years, we will have more people over the age of 65 than children. And that will be the first time in our country's history. So we're really at the sort of tipping point from a demographic standpoint that causes us to think about the kinds of places that we live in. How are we constructing our built environment? What are the mobility options that are offered to people? And what are the implications of the ways in which we've chosen to grow as a nation over the last several decades? And frankly, what does that mean for people's desire to age in place? We know that 3/4 of people 50 and above want to be able to age in their home, in their communities. But increasingly that's becoming harder. And part of the reasons are, well, the reasons are many. One of them is housing is representing an increasingly large share of people's income. We also know that mobility presents a real challenge to being able to age in place. For that time when it's not uncommon for people to live past the age at which they should stop driving. And so what does that then mean for people's independence, for their sense of self? And what does that mean for isolation if you can't get around, if you can't be engaged in a vibrant part of your community? We know that the effects of social isolation actually have very severe and acute health effects as well. But onto that data that we already sort of know and understand is this whole new rich set of data that comes from the benchmarking report, which really informs some of the work that we're already doing. It affirms some of the things that we're doing, but it also points us in the directions of things we need to be doing more of. So one great thing that we saw in the report was that older adults are walking more. The number of walking trips by older adults is up in the last several years, but there's been no growth in the number of older adults riding bikes. So it hasn't declined, which is good news, but really what can we be doing that can get that number to grow? Another really troubling statistic is just the degree to which people 65 and above are overrepresented in pedestrian fatalities in so many states. And that applies both to pedestrian fatalities as well as bike fatalities. So that again is sort of, it underscores the urgency of this work for us. But on the flip side, we see some really positive signals too, that there's been this tremendous growth in open streets events and cities with bike shares. All of those things are, part of the solution. Certainly, when we think about the sort of statistics on fatalities and things like that, that suggests to us that we need to really be doubling down on our efforts to get more complete streets policies in place and more Vision Zero policies adopted. And so that all is part and parcel of how we approach our work. So all this leads us to conclude that we probably are not building communities in the right way. We need to be thinking differently about creating public spaces of the kind you see in the bottom left, really investing in great bike infrastructure of the type that you all know and that we know in so many ways benefits not just bikers, but also pedestrians and local economies and the like. And of course, thinking about different housing options, such as the type you see in the top right, that would provide people more affordable options to stay in their community. So I want to quickly run through how we do this work. First of all, you all should know that we are very active on the federal advocacy side of things. That's something I will not touch on today, nor will I talk about our policy research and our livability index, both of which are important tools, I think, for policy folks to be aware of. But I will dive into some of the work that we do on the programmatic level that may be of use to you. So first of all, you should know that AARP has an office in every state, and each of those state offices are working on livable communities. So wherever you are, find your AARP state office and see how you can partner with them and they can partner with you. We also work with a lot of partners across the country. Certainly we know that AARP is not going to move the needle in our built environment on our own, that we need to both inform people who are shaping that built environment, like American Planning Association and NACTO, but also really learn from folks who have the kinds of expertise that we rely upon to both translate to the folks that we can reach and also ensure that they understand how important these issues are to older adults. So the League is a really important partner to us, as are many others that are hopefully familiar to you. This is just a very brief snapshot of some of the folks that we work with, but we are always open to working with aligned entities in pursuit of great communities. And then finally, I really want to sort of double down on this notion of resources. We really seek to support communities and community leaders like you all very directly. We do that in a few different ways, all of which can be accessed through our website, aarp.org/livable. Starting at the top, we have a raft of publications that are available for free, either via download or in print. Some of the more recent ones that we've done have focused on transportation specifically, and it's kind of a how-to guide for new advocates in this space. We also have a parks guide that invites people to think about their public spaces and connectivity to those public spaces, including bike lanes. And then one of our most sort of impactful tools, I think, has been our walk audit toolkit, where we invite volunteers or community leaders to get out and walk around their neighborhood with folks to evaluate how pedestrian friendly it is, and then to give them a roadmap for local advocacy. We also offer a weekly newsletter that I encourage you all to sign up for. It's a great way to get new information and new resources hot off the presses. We offer something as well called the Network of Age-Friendly States and Communities, and this is about 350 communities that have raised their hand in a voluntary way to say we want to work to become more age-friendly, and that can include issues around housing, transportation, and the like. And then finally, I want to just quickly blast through some of the great projects that we funded through our Community Challenge Grant program. So this is a program that is in its third year. Last year, we allocated about $1.2 million to small, quick action grants around the country, many of which went to enhance bike and ped infrastructure. So just a few snapshots here of some of the grant projects that were funded from around the country. But in addition to the ones that are featured here, we also funded bike share programs in Burlington, Vermont. We have funded bike education and advocacy in Montana and Nebraska. Really across the board, any state that comes forward that has an interesting idea on how to get more people on bikes or out walking, we are happy to entertain. And we know that this really isn't just about getting older adults on bikes. That's certainly an important part of it. But when you're creating a bike infrastructure that addresses the needs of older adults, you're also creating a bike and ped infrastructure that supports everyone. And ultimately, that is our goal, creating great places for all people of all ages. We do a lot of other things on the side as well. We have a good, really solid and extensive volunteer base, one of whom in New Mexico, for example, is making it his mission to get older adults in New Mexico back on bikes and making sure that they feel comfortable bike riding. We do support Ciclovia events around the country and open streets events around the country. And then here in our headquarters in DC, we are in our second year now of hosting our own Bike to Work days, and just in fact got some new bike racks installed in front of our building this week. So lots of small victories and lots of work to be done. But we're so pleased to be a part of this, and we really look to the benchmarking report as an important wayfinder, frankly, for us in terms of making sure that we're on the right track of how we're investing our time and resources.
Thank you for that, Danielle. It's really exciting. It's great to hear about Bike to Work Day, which is coming up in a few weeks. We got a couple of questions that came in, and I just wanted to hit one of them before I take back the screen. And that's someone who is trying to organize more bike activities at their local senior center. And they're wondering if AARP can offer any assistance on that kind of organization.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple different things that I mentioned very quickly, the Network of Age-Friendly States and Communities. Go to our website, aarp.org/livable, and under the heading that says Age-Friendly Network, you will be able to identify whether or not that community is a part of our age-friendly network. If they are, it may very well be that that senior center or the Department on Aging for that community has already sort of signed on to this notion of creating more, diverse multimodal transportation options. So that's one place to start. But in terms of working with the senior center, I would certainly, again, reach out to your AARP office. It may be that they have volunteers in that community who can help put together a reacquainting oneself with biking, or frankly, even we've seen some interesting experiences with e-bikes and bringing e-bikes out to people, kind of giving them the chance to test ride them a little bit. That really has opened the doors to some new mobility options that people were not aware of. And then certainly check our website for new ideas and resources through our publications as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. And so we're love to see the questions come in. As people are thinking of questions they want to ask, please use the question box. I'm going to do some walkthrough of the rest of the report to give you a sense of kind of how to use it and what's in this big, about 415-page report. It is always a little hard to summarize what is in a report so large. So we've kind of touched on the introduction in the overall trends and which places are included in the benchmarking report. You've heard from some of the people who are featured in the Find Your Angle chapter. And the next chapter is this Make Your Case chapter, which is a pretty lengthy chapter. It looks at 10 different topics, each featured in its own section. So healthy communities, safe transportation, strong economies, things like that. And when I think about these things, I really think about, like, within each of these sections, there's kind of discussions that kind of help you get a primer on an issue. There are things that give you unique data on an issue. There's kind of graphics and flowcharts or things that you might be able to take and kind of steal and use in your work. And then there are things that are just kind of giving you ideas, kind of giving you that reference material that will help you in your conversations with your city or anyone else you're trying to engage in this work. So when I say primers, this is kind of every section of the Make Your Case chapter follows a similar structure. So there's 2 to 3 cases that are examined, the case for something or the case of something. And then there's 2 or 3 other topics that are featured for each section. So our Advancing Understanding kind of branded topic is an area where we want to know more about something related to biking and walking, but the data isn't quite there yet. So we kind of discuss why it would be helpful to have that and why we lack the data now, or what processes might lead to that data in the future. Embracing equity is kind of getting more at the disparities that people experience within biking and walking, and when they go to bike and walk, whether people are safe or less safe. And and getting a little bit at that kind of social determinants of health angle that you've heard a few times. And then there's making the health connection, which is kind of really trying to make that connection from whatever we're saying about biking and walking to how this affects public health. When we're thinking about bicycling and walking safety, that obviously has the direct public health impact of people dying prematurely on our streets. There are also all sorts of healthcare costs associated with people not being physically active or being injured but not killed on our streets. So that's several of the things that we were looking into. In terms of unique data, we were really trying to leverage our Bicycle Friendly America program. So that's the Bicycle Friendly community, business, university, and state programs. We started our community program in 1995. So we have good relationships with many communities and states and business universities that give us unique access to data. We partnered with the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals to do a survey of their membership. So some of the data from that survey is available in this report. And then we also surveyed our league member organizations in a way that the Alliance for Biking and Walking also did, so that we could compare how our organizations approach biking and walking advocacy to how the Alliance organizations approach biking and walking advocacy, and see what changes there have been since 2016. We also wanted to make sure that there were some graphics and flowcharts you could take and hopefully use in your communities, use in your work. Some of these flowcharts explain federal funding programs. Some of these graphics deal with the unique data that we get from the Bicycle Friendly Community Program and kind of giving that comparative information about what you can expect or what the average is for that type of data at various award levels within that program. And then there's also a lot of data that is just kind of different presentations of commuting to work data or safety data that is available from the federal government. And then the last kind of thing that I think the Make Your Case chapter is really useful for is just kind of like idea books, like, kind of getting at that reference material, making those connections of, if you don't have a certain type of bicycle facility in your screen, in your community, what is that bike facility? How do you define it? Where would you go if you wanted to learn more about it? So we tried to give some of that kind of more reference material that hopefully is helpful for you as an advocate or somebody in a city government or as a consultant or whatever. And so those are the use cases I really see in the Make Your Case chapter. It's a large chapter. There's a lot of things in there. I'm sure that there are ways to use it that I have not even thought of. So I encourage you to dig into it, flip around it. This is a 415-page report. Not expecting you to read it all in one sitting, but it's a good thing to kind of have around, look through. When you don't know where to start on a topic, the benchmarking report is by no means comprehensive, but it is large enough and diverse enough that it probably has a hook that can get you going. So I recommend looking into it. Show Your Data kind of gets back to kind of that core mission of the benchmarking report, which is really to provide easy access to data that biking and walking advocates might not otherwise have. The big limitation, of course, is that it's only the 50 largest cities in the United States and 19 additional cities. If your city isn't one of those 69 cities, I would encourage you to reach out to me, and I can help guide you to how you can find similar data for your community. We would love to see this expanded in the future. We've tried to integrate with our Bicycle Friendly State and our Bicycle Friendly Community program so that we can reach everyone who participates in those programs. And hopefully in the future, that means that we can include more communities in this type of reporting. But the show your data is mostly tables. So it is, the reference data about biking and walking in the United States, and hopefully easy to reference, easy to grab for you. It's 142 different types of data are presented throughout the show your data chapter. And they're broken down into 10 types of data. 10 kind of looks at data, whether that's rates of biking, walking, or the demographics, which both primarily use Census Bureau data. Public health indicators, where you're looking at different things if you're looking at the national, state, or local level. Safety plans and policies, which kind of rely a little bit more on not federal data, but survey data. Things like traffic laws and training and staff community support, that's really more publicly available data or survey data. So it's really a mix that is probably difficult to find in other sources, but it's all in one place here. And each one you're able to say a little different things. So this was well timed with the National Household Travel Survey, which provides roughly once a decade update on all travel in the United States. It lets us look at things for biking and walking that we wouldn't be able to say otherwise, since we only get data on commuting trips every year, and this is data on all trips. And then when you look at states and cities, you can say slightly different things. I don't want to go too over it, but just try to give a high-level look at the types of things that are in here. So we also wanted to make sure we were looking at demographics of active transportation. We're looking for overrepresentation or underrepresentation, primarily of people with lower incomes or people from lower income households, commuters of color. Unfortunately, except at the national level, you're really kind of stuck with commuters, not all travel. And then also looking at women and whether they're biking and walking more or less than men. And unfortunately, for biking especially, I believe women are underrepresented in every single state, every single city by a good amount. And that's really one of those indicators of, do we have networks where everyone feels safe? And we just aren't there yet. But there's also a lot of good things happening. So we were also able to report a lot of different statistics on road safety. Since we are kind of stuck without the ideal kind of exposure background, we don't really know the miles traveled or minutes traveled or that background rate that we can easily reference, like cars have vehicles miles traveled. There's no nationally available bicycle miles traveled, miles walked at the state and local level available throughout the country. So we tried to provide multiple analysis of fatality data to make up for that. So you'll see it by population, you'll see it by bike or pedestrian commuter, you'll see it as a percentage of traffic fatalities. We're just trying to give that context. So, maybe one doesn't seem to fit your community, but another one can and can still be that comparative resource that's helpful. Although we would love to have exposure data in the future. And then there is a lot of good survey data collected from various sources. Some other organizations do a great job, like National Complete Streets Coalition has a great complete streets inventory that was very helpful. Rails to Trails Conservancy has some great data that was very helpful to look at. And Federal Highways does some great compilation of state level data that was super helpful for this section. And there is a lot of effort. The unfortunate thing about transportation is these things take time, but there's a lot going on right now that I think states and communities can learn from. Traffic laws, training, and staffing is another area where there's a lot of survey data Of course, laws are things that we did some original research on, and I wrote our Bike Law University series that looked at a lot of laws. We also looked at some pedestrian-oriented laws, which seem to have fewer resources around them. But there's some interesting things happening there. I think state laws with speed enforcement cameras and red light cameras are an area that a lot of people are talking about. And unfortunately, there's a lot of states that have laws that make it difficult to implement those systems at this point. But you can find that information here. You can find maps about that. If you need a bigger image, a bigger map, please reach out to me at ken@bikeleague.org. We're happy to work with you to make sure that the data is in the format that's most useful to you. If you're from one of these 69 cities featured in the benchmarking report, you can also find all of our member organizations in those cities. So if you're looking for a way to get involved, looking for an organization to reach out to, that's something in this report. And we also looked at funding, mostly federal funding, because that's what's available in a consistent format. But we use surveys to ask about state and local funding. It's a little harder to find, but we did the best for what's in there. And so, again, I would just encourage you to dig into this report, try to see what's most applicable to your situation. And then if you have any questions about how you can get more information, or if you need, one of the charts in a different format or whatever, just please reach out to me at ken@bikeleague.org. So now we have some time for questions. Not as much as I was thinking. And I'll do the last plug for downloading it if you haven't already. It's bikeleague.org/benchmarking-report. There's a few questions here. The slides should be available for download. This webinar is recorded. We will distribute that soon after it is finished. Got a question about data from municipalities and whether their data is accurate. The way we approach that in the benchmark report is, this is survey data. We would work with our local member organization often to do the outreach to the municipality or state, and then we report what they tell us. We simply don't have the capacity to fact check every single survey data reported. So we make sure that it's survey data. It is what the governments report to us. If we think that it deserves a little more contextualizing than that, we try to provide that. And the appendix does go into all of our survey instruments. But it can be difficult, and if you look into the report, you will notice that some city and state data is sparser than others, around funding. Cities and states sometimes have difficulty determining what to report for that. Someone asks if there is data on access to transit stations. We definitely talk about that in the Make Your Case chapter. There is a section on connected routes, and I believe that touches on connectivity to transit. There is a question about bicycle-friendly universities data. Unfortunately, I don't think that made the report, but that is an area that we are interested in the future. We definitely featured businesses and communities, and I'm not remembering offhand if there's any university data. And then the other question that is in there, is anyone working on how to collect reliable data on non-commute trips? I think there are some efforts. The Federal Highway Administration recently began accepting non-motorized data into their traffic monitoring analysis system. So there is a uniform format that they're promoting. BYRON, are you still available? Do you have any insight on collecting non-commute trips?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. It is certainly something we have wrestled with in the national perspective. In particular, peer-to-peer between different jurisdictions. Commute data is the stuff that's been reported the most frequently for the longest time. We're a little bit fortunate that in Metro Atlanta we have a few different survey sources that we have relied on that have been cultivated by our agency and several peers, including a very fancy travel demand model that we can sometimes call on for interesting modeled information building on our local household travel surveys. So we have tried to piece together several different things. All of it is imperfect. All of it is a snapshot or a model, but we have found some creative sources. And I will put in a big plug for some of our research institutions, in particular Georgia Tech, and several researchers and professors there who have really started to make understanding non-commute travel an important part of their program. So it's something that we're evolving more about. And I'm speaking on behalf of the Association of Bike Ped Professionals. It's a conversation that comes up with our members a lot. And we're certainly enthusiastic about the national conversation moving more in that direction. But still, for the moment, a lot of it's imperfect.
Okay. Thank you. And I have a question for Danielle. This person is interested in if you've seen any positive impact of the available e-bikes for older adults, or if you have any thoughts about e-bikes for older adults.
Yeah, definitely. No, we've seen that it's been a really surprising and wonderful sort of addition into the landscape of mobility options, in part because it just alleviates some of the physical demands of biking, particularly if there are hills or long distances involved. So we've actually done a story. I sent a link to you, which hopefully you can distribute to the larger group, that includes an article that we wrote recently on it, just to kind of capture some of the examples around the country that we're seeing of how e-bikes can really be used to get people back on bikes in ways that they hadn't been in a while. I will say that I only have sort of anecdotal knowledge of a few places that have done that in our network, but in one case it is Vermont, where they just kind of through, not with any particular funding, they just used an event to bring out an e-bike provider and combine that with a member event, an event that focuses on AARP members, just to sort of, again, acquaint them with the technology, give them a test run on it. Maybe they offered a small discount on a ride or something like that subsequent to the meetup. But often it's just that kind of introduction and effort to connect people with the technology that can really change the way people perceive that as an option.
Yeah, definitely at our National Bike Summit, there is a lot of excitement around e-bikes and kind of providing those new mobility options to people of all ages. And kind of like BYRON said, also figuring out how scooter mobility fits into all of this.
Ken, I don't know if you mind forwarding that link that I sent to you. I'll try and send it again as well.
Yeah, I can I think send it to the entire audience. Or maybe I'll accidentally click it and everyone will get it. So we are right about at time. I don't know if Danielle or BYRON, you want to give any closing remarks, and then we'll wrap this up. And thank you for everyone who attended today. If you haven't downloaded already, the benchmark report on bicycling and walking in the United States, bikeleague.org/benchmarking-report. Download it, use it, reach out to me at ken@bikeleague.org when you have questions or comments or need something blown up for a poster or whatever, however you're using it. I'm just excited to see how people use this data in their work.
Yeah, Ken, I'll just maybe say one thing, and I would say that this report is like a Christmas gift to advocates. I mean, it really is. You can't ask for a better sort of compendium of arguments and statistics and factoids and perspectives to get you going. So I really applaud the League for pulling it together, and it's both impressive in its weight and its girth, but also in the richness of the data. So really kudos to you all for doing it.
Thank you.
And Ken, I'll echo that too, and I think it's particularly valuable to have this as a resource that's been published for over a decade now, and the continuity of that as a research project is really valuable. And like I said, we have really built our program out of the benchmarking report, and a lot of our regional efforts have come from the initial insights in those first few volumes, and we're excited for the League to grab that torch and carry it, in addition to all the previous staffs that have built that report. And you did mention it was a bit of an advocacy document, but I think we had a harder time using some of the previous versions when they get more specific on national questions. But I was really pleased to see in the 2018 volume that it has largely stayed very neutral and just provided facts and insight into focus areas. So it continues to be a document that we call on a lot and pass to our partners a lot.
Thank you. I mean, I know the Alliance appreciated it, and we appreciate the support that the CDC and AARP have provided throughout the course of the benchmarking report. We also had great partners in Tool Design Group for this version, and we had a great team of about, I want to say 20 or 30 people involved in a committee that helped me kind of scope the report and make sure that it was serving those goals. So it's great to hear that it's worked out well for both of you and hopefully everyone online. And with that, we are just past 2. So I want to say thank you to everyone for staying with us. And again, please download the report, please use it, and let us know how you're using it. And have a great rest of the day. Bye.